Today's business organizations are going through certain kinds of problems. There have been studies, there have been earlier research on that. Let's look at two issues which might possibly give us some idea as to what kind of challenges and what kind of problems today's organizations go through. There was a book written sometime in 1996-97 called The Living Company. This was written by an executive director planning of Shell, the Royal Dutch Shell Company. The research that went behind this book was a simple question, which is, how long will companies indeed live? This was a question, and in order to answer that, some amount of research which culminated in the publication of a book. There are a couple of interesting observations in the book which I would like to share. It appears that 1/3 of Fortune 500 companies listed in 1970 did not exist in 1983. They either folded, they vanished, they were bought over, taken over. It has transformed, and it doesn't exist in its original identity. Another study point which this book brings forth is all new companies. If you look at all those new companies, 40% of them do not exist after 10 years. That's the life expectancy of firms in general. And as I said, Fortune 500 companies, 1/3 of them did not exist after 13 years, 1970 to 1983. So what is this actually pointing to? Is longevity of business organizations not an issue? Or is it difficult? Or is it that we practice certain paradigms which results in these kinds of behavior, these kinds of outcomes that we have been seeing? This is a question that we need to understand. Let's look at another data point. Let's take a simple example of how do we improve productivity. This is a very important question. So let's take a machine. Let's first think about a machine. Now, what is the way we go about addressing this problem? We buy a good machine. We add more gadgets to it. Maybe we modify the machine so that it can perform in a very optimal speed, increase productivity, and so on. If you overwork the machine, lubricate it, have better lubrication mechanism so that the wear and tear is under control. Change the parts if they come in the way of improving the productivity, increasing the productivity, maybe change the parts. And a time may come when you change the machine itself because you find a better machine or there is too much wear and tear in this machine. So this is our approach to solving the productivity problem when we use machines. Let's look at the other side, which are the people. Now let me explain how every one of what we did in the machine, that seems to be a parallel with the people. For example, you recruit a good resource. That's the first step. And then provide supporting gadgets, provide whatever other solutions and systems that you need to provide so that this resource will work very well. If this resource gets heated up, what I mean is I get frustrated, this person is a little upset, give him some incentives, give him a planned paid holiday and so on. This is like lubricating the machine, which I was talking about on the other side. If the productivity is still not increasing, change the job specs, maybe change this person, take him elsewhere and so on, and see if it works. If it doesn't work, just discard. Look for another person, give him a pink slip, and that's it. So everything that we spoke about in the machine seems to have a parallel with people. So In some sense, the paradigm seems to be a mechanistic paradigm with which we want to look at a living entity called a human being. So this is a question that we need to really ask. Why are we doing it, or is it what we are trying to do? So that brings us to the possibility of broad basing the current paradigms. Maybe asking things which we might not have asked so far, maybe it's the time to ask. So let me introduce a metaphor of a business organization, which you find not only in this book, The Living Company. Some particle physicists have been writing about it. There are other people who have been writing about it. So the idea is as follows. If you look at a business organization from a mechanistic paradigm, so what I mean by mechanistic paradigm is there are parts which make up a system. The sum of the parts is equal to the total. Parts can be individually analyzed, repaired, replaced, corrected, and all that. This is another this is what is called mechanistic paradigm. Whereas if you really take a paradigm of a living entity, it comes with a very different kind of perspectives which we need to actually think. First of all, even before going that, if you have mechanistic paradigm, it's all right to own. If you have a living paradigm, you cannot own. It's an immoral idea to own. Nobody can own living beings. So that itself is a basic change. Now there are a few other things. Living entities, the sum of the parts are not equal to the total. The total can be much more than the sum of the parts. It cannot be repaired. It cannot be, as we do in a mechanistic thing, you can't do things here. It cannot be repaired that easily. The most interesting thing is living entities seem to have a very complex sense of interdependency, which means you cannot look at individual parts and imagine that if you sort out a part of the system will behave. Living entities don't work like that. They are hugely interconnected. There is a huge sense of interconnectedness, which means our approach to understand, our approach to solve problems needs to be much more than this splitting them into parts, analyzing parts and reassembling them. So that kind of a metaphor does not work. So maybe it is time for us to understand that there is merit to look at a business organization as a living entity in which the way we understand, the way we living entities synthesize. They evolve from one system to a next higher level of system through a complex circuitry of learning and so on. So should we have to look at those kinds of issues? So this is an aspect which we need to understand, because maybe it solves some of the problems that we might be currently facing. Now, what are the key attributes and implications if we assume that a business organization is actually a living entity? Now there are four things which we need to be very clear. The first thing is living entities are very sensitive to the environment. So what it really means is that living entities must have a certain inherent ability to adapt. The system exists on account of the environment, and when changes happen in the environment, the system must be able to adapt. So it calls for a very different kind of a learning system that we need to put in place. That's the first attribute and the implication. The second, living entities are inherently very cohesive, and they have a very strong sense of identity. It's in their DNA. So if we have to understand that, then the implication for us is how do we build a community, how do we build a sense of ownership. So these are very important issues that we need to worry when we talk about a business organization as a living metaphor or a living entity. Third thing that is very, very special and peculiar is living beings are more tolerant. They tend to be more tolerant. So what it means is one has to stretch the possibilities through activities. In the margin, experiments are to be encouraged and so on. So what it means is, how do we construct strong relationship with entities within and outside? This is very, very important, because that's how it builds that sense of tolerance that is very peculiar of living organisms. The last thing is, quite a few business organizations which the living company researchers studied somehow came to a conclusion that if you take a metaphor of a living entity for business organizations, they tend to be very conservative in financing, which has serious implications to growth and evolution. So these are some of the possibilities that we need to be very aware of. More importantly, the point that we need to be aware is things like adaptive learning, things like creating a sense of identity, preserving a personal space, providing a strong sense of identity, communication systems which build these, all these are very, very important. So whether we talk in terms of work practices, work culture, or in terms of leadership practices, the culture of leadership, what to look for in nurturing these issues, these are going to be very, very important. Perhaps given the kind of problems that we go through, it may be a good idea to look at some alternative paradigms which may give us some answers, and perhaps that's where one can even look at alternative body of knowledge. For instance, ancient Indian wisdom comes from a different perspective. Perhaps it looks at things in a different way. So I think there is value in taking a clean slate and get into alternative paradigms, maybe wisdom which were created in different contexts, in different times of this evolution of this human society. Maybe there is something to learn. That's what I think we must really reflect on, and some efforts in those directions might be very rewarding.